name is Nkabeng Mzileni. I'm the regional ecologist for the arid and central parks. With the South African national parks, there are 5 regional ecologists distributed across the country. And we have regional ecologists for the Kruger National Park in Mapungubwe. We have myself for the arid and central parks. And there's somebody for the Cape Parks and another lady for all our marine parks. And there's another lady who looks after the Frontier Eastern Cape Park. So we're all distributed around to basically bring together the different scientists and expertise when it comes to the management of the national parks. So we're that interface between the science, the management, and the policy for national parks. But for today, I will be going through a discussion regarding conservation and farming, especially when it comes to agricultural livestock farming specifically, and where we've come from in terms of how national parks have approached conservation and agricultural livestock farming and the direction that we are planning to take. But in order to do that, I first need to give us a little bit of context. I'm just trying to get my screen to move to the next screen. There we go. Okay. Yeah, perfect. So essentially the purpose of our discussion today is to talk about the national parks perspectives, where we've come from and the direction we're going in. Even though here I've mentioned that the desired state of national parks is based on its vision, mission, and vital attributes, what we mean by desired state is not necessarily how we want the park to look, but essentially a desired state encompasses biodiversity characteristics, ecosystem services and processes, cultural heritage, historical and scenic features. So it's a whole accumulation of things that we're taking into account, not just the visuals that we want to look at. And something that's quite key that we must also take into account is that these national parks are all embedded within a broader land use mosaic. Basically, that means that these national parks almost become islands. Surrounding them, you have urbanization, you have agriculture, you have mining, you have some other protected areas with some of our national parks. So there's a whole variation in what's happening just within our borders. So we have to be aware that in some ways we are islands, but in other ways we have to learn how to adapt to the environment that's around us. In so doing as well, that means we also have to be aware of facilitating the sharing of benefits. So embedded within our mandate, we do touch on the socioeconomic transformation, and we also touch on other elements of how we connect and allow access to resources within the national parks. And this is both in terms of consumptive and non-consumptive benefits. So yes, there's the ecotourism side, but there's also the extraction of resources in terms of, for example, the water, thatch grass, even the wildlife. There's different ways of accessing those resources. And obviously we have to participate in the job creation as well. So how do we get to a desired state? This is not a question very easily answered, but essentially we have several steps that we follow and several areas that we try to accomplish. So we have regional integration, because national parks can't occur in isolation. We have to be aware of what some of the targets and activities are within the region that we occur in. And this also includes from a biomes and a bioregional perspective as well. We obviously have the biodiversity, and that varies from all the big and hairies to the beautiful flying birds to the flora to the little bugs running around. So it's all encompassing that we try to touch on all of these areas. And quite a key one that we'll talk about today as well is just water in the landscape. This is obviously a very critical resource, not only for consumption and human use, but also a lot of industry requires access to water, and therefore the surface water, groundwater, fresh water, all of this is part of our desired state of what's the quality that we want. And then tourism, heritage, stakeholder engagement is absolutely key, because we're in a mosaic of different land uses, we have to be aware of what is it that we're contributing in terms of the stakeholders. And I mentioned before, access to benefits and effective park management. So something that's quite key, and you'll see this pop up a few times, is embedded within our vision, our mandate, and our mission, is that we're looking at sustainability. I know for some people, sustainability can have different definitions, but essentially we're looking at it from, we're here now, we're sustaining it, and we want to move into a thriving perspective from here. And also the concept of expansion as well. We have a current footprint, but there's also the expansion of what is expected from national targets, national mandates, and also from global perspectives as well. So just to get a little bit more detail about what it is and who we are as national parks, we have three broad pillars that we stand on. So it's the conservation, sustainable conservation. We have the responsible tourism, and we have the socioeconomic transformation. For the purpose of today's talk, I'm mostly going to focus on the sustainable conservation, because this is where we talk about the expansion of the national and global conservation state, which obviously includes our grasslands. Now, we know that grasslands are quite vital, however, they're very poorly protected, even though we have wonderful landscapes within the South African arena. We don't have a lot of it that's actively protected. So that's why it's quite an important one for us to put right in there in terms of some of the things that we're trying to achieve. And then we also have the effective and sustainable management of ecosystems. As we mentioned before, we're trying to sustain and facilitate ecosystem services and ecosystem processes. So that's what builds into our vision of the design things. And then from that, we also look at sustainable use of the biological resources, as I mentioned before. How do we now get them to thrive and then move them into the next phase of being able to allow people access to using these resources? Now, this is quite a broad topic, so I'm going to try my best to try to hone it down so that we start to get very park specific. So essentially with national parks, we have roadmaps. Because we have such broad targets and so many of them, we have to sort of narrow it down into bite-sized chunks that we can actually start to achieve. So we have our strategic plan, which is the roadmap of what it is that needs to be done. And this touches on those three pillars: the conservation, the tourism, and the socioeconomic. That's the roadmap. And then we have our annual performance plan, which reviews assesses how well we did with reaching those targets that were set out in the plan. And then we also have our annual report, which is mostly scientific based, but this also provides feedback and a little bit more detail about the actual work that was done in order to meet the targets. So as was mentioned in the introduction, there's about 20 national parks. We're in the progress of adding number 21 into the national park. Most of these parks are distributed across the different biomes. Even though this map shows the provinces, I'll show another map later on that shows the different biomes, which is basically the estates that we're trying to conserve as well and include into the protected areas. As we're going through the establishment of all of these protected areas, obviously there's a lot of legislation and policies that we have to go through as well in terms of your NEMPA, and all of those other NEMA legislation that we have to go through. As I mentioned today, that there are 20 national parks. One of the parks that's not included just falls around here is the Meerkat National Park, which is part of the SKA project regarding the square kilometer array and those dishes. A very interesting park, and definitely park unusual is the word that we use when we're discussing that park. But for today, I'm going to discuss the grassland parks. Golden Gate, which has been around since the 1960s, and a lot has changed, a lot has happened, a lot of expansion has taken place. So I want to discuss Golden Gate, where we've come from, and the new park that is being discussed and established in the south, which at the moment is being called the Eastern Cape Grassland National Park, which is a complete polar opposite of what SANParks would traditionally do in terms of park establishments, but I'll get into more detail about that in a moment. Before I get into a bit more detail, I just wanted to just shed a little bit more light in terms of what the South African national targets are and how all of this falls into what, as South African national parks, we're trying to achieve. So essentially, our targets, South African targets, are taken from national as well as global targets, and this includes the management of biodiversity assets, and their contribution to the economy, rural development, job creation, and social well-being, and improving the network of protected areas and conservation areas, which represents ecosystems and species, as mentioned before, and making sure that these are effectively managed. It's not a small task. And this includes species of special concern, making sure that these are suitably managed. And that list is very long. Yes, it starts with the big and hairies, but it also comes down to some smaller animals, invertebrates, and as well as plant species as well are included in these species of special concern. Part of our national targets include that biodiversity economy, or the wildlife economy, is expanded on, is strengthened, and it's transformed so that SANParks becomes an active participant in that, and that it becomes inclusive as well. And that's essentially when it comes to biodiversity conservation, we are supporting land reform and also social economic opportunities. Now, land reform is something that we'll touch on when we discuss Golden Gate. So I just wanted to include this excerpt because yes, SANParks is trying to increase the amount of land that is being protected, but we also want to be aware of the habitats that we are actually protecting, so that it's not just a matter of land is land, let's just take more, but that we're actually strategic about what it is that we're including in here. Now, to be able to do that, we do assessments within our parks and outside the parks, just so that we can be strategic of the direction that we're expanding in. It's not just a matter of there's no one in the southern region, let's go that way, but let's make sure that it's a habitat that needs to be protected as well. You'd see over here, there was between 1990 and in the 2010s, there was a huge jump in the terms of the hectares of habitats that were protected. That's because several of the parks were expanded during that time to be inclusive of some of the habitats that were needed. And one of the main parks that was expanded was Golden Gate. An additional 26,000 hectares were included during that time period. But just to give a brief synopsis about, how do we get to this point of national parks versus habitats? Essentially, we're looking at the habitat quality. Like I said, it's not just land for land's sake, but it also has to have a purpose, and it also has to be something that can be rehabilitated and brought back to that desired state, as mentioned earlier. So the habitat quality and what it is that can now be pushed forward in terms of access for people to now use those resources or get access and benefits to what the habitat has to offer. And although we may have some limitations in terms of actively being in the parks and measuring the habitats, we are fortunate that now we have innovations and technologies, remote sensing, Landsat, and all of those fancy technologies that we'll use, and that can help us now predict directions that we need to be expanding in, and how now we can actually start improving what it is that we already have. So let's get into our grassland parks now. Let's start with Golden Gate. Golden Gate is situated up here in the northern section of Lesotho, well, just on the outside here, in this eastern section of the Free State. And the other park that is currently going to be discussed is in this southern section of Lesotho, just in that north eastern section of the Eastern Cape. So we know that when it comes to grasslands, they're very important biomes to be conserved, because when it comes to the land mass, there's not a lot of it that's actually being conserved, but we know that it's important. I'm going to have to choose my words quite carefully, because what I'm going to say might sound controversial, but I'm going to try and get my words correct with this one. So when it comes to grasslands, it's not so much that they have high biodiversity compared to other biomes, and it's not so much that they have really endangered or threatened species occurring in them, because most of the species that we find, especially in terms of grasses and vegetation, some of the invertebrates in there, are commonly occurring. What's important for grasslands are the ecosystem services that they're providing. So I'll get into a little bit of a list of what some of these services are. But in terms of water catchment, for example, fodder for livestock, because obviously livestock is something that we need in order for survival and production and economy. It's also quite important when it comes to carbon storage. However, there's some impacts that can also have. So there's a lot that when we put the grassland biome into context, it's not the individual species or the biodiversity, but it's the combination of what that system is actually providing once you put it all together. Okay, so Golden Gate. This is the location of Golden Gate. Initially, it started off as Clark National Park, just a provincial park just here. And then over here, and this was Golden Gate National Park. And then this all became one national park. And even as we speak, it's still being expanded now. So this section over here in the southern area, in the southern part of the park, is also going to be fenced off and included in the park. And over here as well in the north, this is also going to become included. Now, the activities that border the area, we have some towns, high population, high density towns, such as Buta de Chaba over in the eastern section. And we have a lot of livestock and agricultural practices occurring outside the park. But because of how the park was established, as I mentioned before, it used to be just this smaller area and became a larger area. It means now that we also have land claimants inside the park as well. Some are legal, some questionable, and it's a work in progress as South African National Parks works with the Department of Rural Development to start to decide or to make a plan going forward and what can actually take place within the park. So Golden Gate at the moment stands at about 32,000 hectares, close to 33,000 hectares. And most of it is mountainous, but there are some flat grassland areas still. And it includes some very important threatened and protected habitats, such as the Eastern Free State grassland, the Basotho Mountain shrubland, and as well as the Lesotho Highland basalt grasslands. The vision for the Golden Gate National Park is for it to expand to 113,000 hectares. Now, this is obviously going to take some time and a lot of negotiation. As I mentioned before, there's high density populations and there's agricultural practices taking place outside the park. So these negotiations still have to take place. However, it is quite key that we continue to push to have this land put under formal protection, because there's a vast amount of water that this area now protects. You know, there's about 30% of the total water supply from Southern Africa is produced within this catchment area that Golden Gate now falls within. So it is quite key to keep an eye on that area and expand with that protection. So if anyone hasn't been to Golden Gate before, I just thought I'd throw in some images here just to give you an idea of what it looks like. As I mentioned before, there's some high altitudes. This is part of the Drakensberg-Maluti range. Some very beautiful high altitude landscapes there, and some flat areas as well where you tend to find the animals grazing. Now, when I say animals, I say that quite loosely because we have both livestock and wildlife that are occurring in the park. As I mentioned before, because there were some land claimants, I will show you some image of it now. There are still some properties where people have their fodder, their livestock still inside the park, and also because of the livestock that's on the perimeter of the borders of the park, people bring their animals in to start grazing. So we manage both wildlife and livestock animals in there as well. So as I mentioned, we have our plans because this is quite a massive task to undertake. So we have our management plans that we have in place. And they last for about 10 years. They are adaptive management plans. So that means that we learn as we go and we implement as we go along. And we just we partner with the communities, we partner with educational institutions, with government, with business owners, and we have open discussions to assess where we are, how people can benefit, and how we can work together towards that desired state, and to ensure that people are receiving those benefits in terms of the ecosystem services. So some of the things that are included in here are freshwater, wetlands, vegetation, as I mentioned, the thatch harvesting, I'll get into more detail about that, alien invasives, which are important contributor and challenge when it comes to especially water management because of how much they suck out of there, especially with your black wattle, your poplars, and some of the other species as well. And fire is quite an important one. We know that when it comes to grasslands and fire, it plays quite a big role in terms of maintaining and feeding back into the system. But because of the activities that happen on the periphery, the national park in itself is quite vulnerable to fire. People want to clear the land in preparation for the rainy season. This jumps into the park, the winds, the mountain becomes a runaway fire. something very big that we also have to manage in there as well, and also just have those discussions with the owners around the park, just about how fire works in the system and what it actually means and what the implications are. So as I mentioned before, we have the issue of livestock and land claimants inside the park. So this is actually inside a national park, where somebody has their property there, they have their kraal, they have their camp systems, and they have their fodder for the animals for out of season feed. And then you also have livestock coming into the park. I remember when we took this picture, this was earlier this year, the herder was actually waving at us, and you could see his hunting dogs were there with him. But that's the situation we're in, and we try to work closely with the local police as well to deal with situations like that. But that's how national parks used to work. You buy people out, basically, you set up a boundary and you try to make it pristine. But that can't always be the case. And we have learned that with Golden Gate and with the situation that we have gone through there. In terms of the harvesting of the thatch grasses, some of the thatch grasses that are harvested there are the Hyperrhenia. Vegetation is not my strong point. I'm a zoologist by study, but the Hyperrhenia, we have two of them that are in there. It's the Hirta and the Gigiano. And basically, we go in as SANParks, we measure and monitor the biomass of the thatch, and then we let the park management know which areas and how much of it can be harvested. And then people come into the park, and the park assists them with actually going through the park and harvesting the grass. And this is used for various things. People use it for crafts, for brooms, for housing, and for all sorts of other things. But they come in, we have a set amount of biomass that they can harvest, and they use it for their different purposes. But it is facilitated by national parks. The image down here is some of the shorter grasses that we were dealing with, but the image up here, I wish I had taken the photograph from inside, but essentially that harvesting grass can be taller than me, so it's over 2 meters in height, and you can get lost in those forests, but that's the ideal type of grasses that they need. And what's ideal about it is that it's not necessarily a palatable grass, so we're not taking away from the system, because the way the grasses are caught and the way it's harvested, it feeds back into the system as well, so that the following year there's still a seed bank, and there's still the opportunity for people to come back into the park and harvest again. In addition to this, then we have our wildlife economy program, where we allow people to apply to establish wildlife areas, basically wildlife to them, and assist them with setting up their own enterprise. So they sometimes will donate animals, so things like hartebeest, wildebeest, will donate those, and people then establish their parks from their private establishments from there. So there's a lot of things that are actually happening within the protected area, and that contribution towards the wildlife economy, while also being aware of the ecosystem services that we are providing as a national park into the wider economy and landscape. So now those are the human contributions. We also have to take into account the climatic variables and how this is going to influence how we expand, how we go forward, how we manage, how we have access to resources. So we have a climate vulnerability for all of the national parks. This was conducted back in the 2016 was when this report was put out, and I have the reference in case anybody wants to see it. But essentially, if we look at Golden Gate, we'll see that the vulnerability when it comes to climate change is quite low. So essentially what we're seeing, we're predicting is going to happen in the area is that precipitation is going to increase, but the chances of heat, dry, and disasters happening are quite low. So it's an area that when it comes to fresh water, the changes in the number of wetlands, the quality of the water, the height of the water table, we can see that all of this is actually going to get better. But obviously that means there's going to be implications in terms of the habitat and how we can actually use the landscape and what that means for resource use. And this is currently projects that are taking place in terms of what are the implications going to be. And we partner with institutes like Free State University, University of Pretoria, a bunch of universities in order to address some of these issues. Okay, so now everything I just said about Golden Gate, take it off the table. Now we're going to talk about a completely different approach to the way forward when it comes to our grassland national parks. So here I've put up an image from a team. We were a BioBlitz team from all sorts of institutes, all sorts of backgrounds and expertise come together to look at, okay, this new national park, this new grassland national park, what does it mean? Okay. First of all, we're not going to be putting up any boundaries. We're not going to be buying anyone out, and nobody's getting kicked off their property. That's definitely not the route that SANParks is going to take. Instead, we're going to partner with the current existing landowners to achieve that desired state. Now, remember, the desired state is not necessarily just the visual, but it goes back to those ecosystem processes and facilitating those ecosystem services and just the general characteristics of biodiversity. So essentially, when we went out there as a BioBlitz team and we went to the properties that have been highlighted, those are the ones we visited just now. However, over time, we want to include this whole area. Essentially, what we did was we went to these different properties, and each of those properties are either cattle, sheep, goats, or combination. Some are private, some are communal, and we just assessed the area. We did felt condition assessment. BirdLife was there to check what sort of birds are occurring in the area, because this is high altitude, you know, it's alpine, it's shrubland, it's grassland. What do we find out there? We had the herpetologists as well. It was very fascinating watching somebody fish for lizards. We had the entomologists there as well. We were looking at the wetlands, and all these reports were put together to say, these are the features that are important in property A. These are the features that are important in property B. And we put this together and we go back to the landowner and say, okay, you own cattle. We did a felt condition assessment. Your felt is pretty good, but if you change your practices like this, then we'll be able to facilitate these processes. Basically, we'll be able to allow other species to maybe start coming back. What was quite fascinating, though, was that in a lot of these properties, they were already in fairly decent condition. Obviously, a few things need to be tweaked here and there because it's still livestock. But it's not mission impossible for us to actually have that desired state of those natural systems within farmlands. So it's not friend or foe, it's actually doable. And we are still in early stages of this. As I mentioned, some of the first site visits with the scientists only started this year, but there's more of these still to come so that we can start to encompass more land to be aware of what we can still conserve in the area. But essentially, there are three phases that we still need to get through. So there's the design phase, and we're quite well advanced with that design phase, which is basically setting out the objectives. As we mentioned, it's not going to be a normal park. We're not going to buy anyone out. It's going to be contractual, and we're not setting up any boundaries. We have to identify some of the important attributes, as we mentioned, the wetlands, the water catchments, some of the flora occurring in the area, and the bird life and other biodiversity elements. And we also have to look at the economic constraints, because even though we are in partnership, we have to be aware of what the private landowner can bring to the table and what SANParks and WWF can also bring to the table in order to make this sustainable, as we mentioned before. And then we also have to look at pollutants. Now, pollutants aren't in the traditional term of aerosols and those sorts, but in terms of alien invasives, what's happening in there and how do we mitigate that? So your erosion, your degradation, and your alien invasives, how do we actually mitigate all of that? And what we also have to be aware of is not so much that the livestock is a pollutant in itself, but how do we manage that in a way that is still conducive to allowing those ecosystem processes to continue. So that's the design phase. And then we also have what we call the characterization phase. And this is where we now have the scientists and the experts going out and observing what is actually occurring in the area so that we have something we can compare it to. We have some of those quote unquote pristine areas and some of those areas that are not in that ideal desired state, and how we can now get from point A to point B. So we go out there and we can visualize and characterize all of that. And then we have the diagnosis phase. So this is basically the diagnosis of the pollutant. So it's the erosion, it's the alien invasives, and basically how do we now manage the livestock for the natural processes? And how do we now enhance those ecosystem services and processes under those conditions. As we've mentioned before, it's not mission impossible. We just need to figure out how exactly it is that we're going to do this. So this is just a quick image of where the areas that we were in. This one is a communal area. You can just see water absolutely pristine, really cold, but absolutely beautiful. When we did the water quality assessments, the invertebrates that were found in there indicated that it's still good quality water, and very important to maintain that, because of the water systems that are occurring in national parks or passing through national parks, the more of that water that is protected or occurring within a protected areas, the better the quality of the water. So if you measure the water quality, say pH, salinity, the occurrence of different invertebrates before the river enters the park, that the quality tends to be quite low. But when you measure it inside the park and as it's exiting the park, that water quality already improves. And this has been documented for many, many years. And we have several reports about it. And this is the case in all of our national parks that have a big chunk of our rivers passing through protected areas. It's proven that the quality is improved because of of what's happening within the parks, not just from a human side, but because of those natural processes that are being facilitated in the park. So this is just a visual. Some of the areas that we were having a look at, some people have cattle. Some areas are, I think this was the Themida Tyandra, that was pretty palatable grasses, and if you find them in an area, that means the felt is in pretty decent condition. And then you have some areas that are a little bit eroded, but you can always speak to owners about how best to go about managing that landscape. This is just a quick review, basically, of the things that we looked at while we're in the park and the things that SANParks are interested in protecting within these private landscapes. And essentially, it's the biodiversity as a whole, the flora, the avian species occurring in there. The wetlands are so key. We can't speak enough about how they the impacts that they have and the relevance they have in terms of clearing the water systems. And also in terms of freshwater and terrestrial invertebrates, because these areas are so, especially the communal areas, are so, they're used by livestock, yes, but the way they're used, it allows for some of these invertebrates to thrive in those areas. So we found quite a few species that are either undescribed or they just haven't been observed before in the country. So there is still scope for being able to protect some of these species. But just to touch a little bit more about these grasslands and how they provide these ecosystem services. Throughout this whole talk, I've already touched on quite a few things in terms of water supply, flow regulation, water quality and quantity. The quality is a very important one. Carbon storage is also an interesting one because as climate change, as we mentioned before, in terms of carbon storage, as this increases, as the carbon concentrations increase, that means that woody species now start to thrive and they start to either encroach or densify. When we say they densify, that basically means that they're indigenous, they should be there, it's okay that they're there, but now there's more of them than there used to be. And this starts to reduce the effectiveness of a grassland because now they're becoming more woody. So how do we deal with that? Erosion, they're very vulnerable to erosion, but this can also be managed so that the processes that are occurring can also be pushed on so that they're actually providing those services. Climate mitigation, I mentioned before in terms of the C4 and the carbon storage. And pollination, it's quite a key one, even though we said that the grasslands in themselves don't have high threatened or protected species or diversity, but because they have a lot of the common species occurring, that means pollinators have a wide variety of places they can actually do their thing, do the work that they need to be doing in terms of the agricultural side and within the natural systems as well. And there is still that cultural element when it comes to grasslands, as you mentioned with the thatch harvesting already, that you'll find that in the grasslands, it's not just everywhere, it's within the grasslands. But in terms of the agricultural perspective, grasslands are the ideal place in order to have your livestock and in order to have some of the farms occurring because of the water that's available there so readily, because of the quality of the fodder that's already there readily available, and just the expanse of the landscape to allow the animals to move, and the minimal disease. Yes, there's diseases, but the minimal impact from that side as well. So all of these feed into each other. And it's quite important that SANParks has learned that it is quite possible to go from a system where we used to just put up fences and kick everybody out, and to just learn that the industry has evolved, the economy has evolved, and just the human dynamics have also evolved, and how we don't get left behind. You know, back in the days when national parks were established, we're looking more at a preservation perspective, but that evolved into a conservation perspective. And now it has evolved even more if we're now starting to look at the idea of combining landscape uses, so that it's not just exclusive for one, but that it can actually be facilitate different. Actually, there is a lot of potential to move into this space. It has been done in other countries around the world, and it's something that SANParks is open to learning and to engaging with other places to see how we can take this forward, and so that the services and processes and the biodiversity aren't compromised, but that we can continue to thrive and still take processes further, and to continue to include and engage with stakeholders, because there's perspectives that we may be missing if we don't understand that economic perspective, we don't understand that agricultural perspective. So these stakeholder engagements are quite key and continue to take place. Thank you very much for your attendance, for listening. And these are just some of the references. There's a long list, but this is just some of the references that we use for this presentation. And a lot of it comes from the expertise of national parks. I have to admit, the teams we work with are very knowledgeable and expand on a lot of different areas in terms of biodiversity. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much. That really was an interesting presentation. And I think from the point of view of this series with the African Wildlife Economy Institute, it's also very, very interesting to have an idea of sort of the economies that you are supporting and promoting within the national parks. So I think I will definitely have more questions about that. But we have a question from Alex here in the chat. He says, your talk's been absolutely awesome. And he has two questions. So he asks if grasslands allow for resource stratification. So perhaps you could answer that one, and then I'll ask the second one.
Okay, yes, it does. And this is actually a very interesting one, because when we are discussing in terms of what the uses are and what the access and benefits are, then we have to look at it from all the different perspectives. So yes, we do from the national parks try to touch on that engagement with the communities and try to see what is actually feasible, because even though we are still a conservation protection, still trying to conserve what is still usable, what can still be extracted at the different levels while still maintaining or sustaining what is occurring within the area. So yes, we do try to aim for that, that stratified approach. I'm not sure if I'm answering a quote, if that answers the question.
Okay, and I guess, no, I think that answers it very nicely, and I will unmute you just now, Alex, but I will just form your second question and then unmute you there. So he's wondering what your ultimate goal is. Is it sustainable or regenerative agriculture with the focus on maximizing farming output? So maximizing being a big word in itself. Do you want to maximize farming output as well as biodiversity, or how are you going to measure the two against each other? And I will just, before you reply on that, unmute Alex. Alex, I don't know if you're here and want to add on a little bit to your question.
Yeah, I just want to say, Doc, thanks very much for the chat, for the presentation. It's really interesting. I think for those of us that have been interested in this topic for a while, it's nice to see the way that you're going. I think that if I could just add to that last bit of my question, is that the US is the only example I can think of in this instance, but it's probably because I'm a little bit uneducated on the matter. Are we looking at better utilization of our parks in terms of things of like utilization, conservation, forestry, where applicable, and so on and so forth? Is that an ultimate goal or not so much?
Okay, so thank you. And that is a very good question, because we have to be cautious with the story that we are trying to tell. Because at the end of the day, the South African National Parks is still a conservation organization, and that is still going to be the main focus. In terms of whether farmers are going to be maximizing their production, that's a bit of a different story, because it has to be in line with still facilitating those processes. So back in the day, we used to have a term that we used called that threshold of potential concern. So that would still apply in this context of how far or how far can they go before they start to compromise the biodiversity and those systems, ecosystem services processes that we're trying to facilitate. So that's still a discussion to establish that benchmark, but we still take into account that threshold so that we don't defeat the purpose of still being a conservation organization.
100%. And then, sorry, just last thing. What benefit does it provide these farmers other than from a conservation perspective? So is there financial benefit to them? Do they get rebates of some sort? I don't know if you covered that or if I maybe missed it.
Okay, no, I didn't cover that, and that is a very good question. So what happens is they will end up getting from tax and economic rebates. Yes, they will have that. And for some of the landowners, it's actually quite interesting. Some of their feedback is that they like that association of saying, WWF, South African National Parks, we're making this contribution.
100%.
It helps when they're marketing their product. So there is that economic.
Okay, no, that's awesome. I think that the fact that you're able to create a benefit for these farmers in order to maybe guide things towards a direction that's good for conservation is outstanding. And, I don't mean this in a condescending way. I'm exceptionally proud of you guys. This is so awesome to see. Thank you very much.
Okay, no, thank you. No, it's not condescending at all. It's great for us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for this.
So, Nkabeng, my question to you is, plans like these have been in the offing for a while. Research is quite far ahead of action and policy on the ground. What do you feel is different about you specifically, or the team that you work with, or the group that have managed to get this off the ground finally as an idea and a vision for a grassland national park? Why has it taken so long when we knew about this 10 years ago?
No, that's a very good question. And sadly, I come across it quite often that the theory is there, but the actual implementation where it's useful, it takes a very long time. But it's, as I mentioned before, South Africa is a little bit different from other parts of Africa because we like to put up fences and just keep things in or keep things or people out, and that can be quite controversial. But we've moved away from that perspective. It's very difficult if you look at it globally to now displace people to build dams, for example, or just actually displacing people for other activities. It's become a little bit controversial and it's not as accepted anymore. So rather than becoming outdated or just not being relevant anymore and not fulfilling our role, we have to adapt. And because these are things that are taking place in terms of the human, the farming, and the wildlife being able to coexist, it's taking place in other places on the continent and in the world. South Africa is now starting to get to the point of saying, okay, guys, enough is enough. We see that it's happening. Even if it's not perfect, we can at least get started and adaptive management learn as we go along. And definitely with the team that we have on board, they're very much focused on not falling behind and remaining relevant. And they have enough of that expertise. It's over 20, 30, 40, 60 years of expertise and learning that we have done over time to get us to this point, to be able to push it forward. So definitely it's not just from SANParks to actually push it to make it happen, but also from some of the other institutes that is putting their hands up and saying, we can help with this expertise if you're lacking it. Like the rural development, for example, having that interaction with land claimants, land tenants, and saying, this is how you interact with them, and this is how we'll support you if issues come up and how to take it forward. I hope that helps a bit with the answer.
It does indeed, and it leads me to a second question. How do you decide to measure success, be that in a 5-year time frame or a 10-year time frame? What would be your parameters to say you were successful in this initiative?
Okay, now that's a very good question. So we work on those management plans that are those 10-year cycles. And we review them at different intervals in that cycle. And those ones help us to have a look to see if we're heading towards restoring those natural processes. Hence, I mentioned it was quite important to do those site visits because we could see the areas that are already being utilized and the kind of impacts that's happening there, and areas that are a little bit more pristine and not as accessible by livestock. And you can start to see what's occurring over there. So we start to get a bit of an idea of, okay, it can look like this. We can start to head in that direction. And we also now have some of those national targets that also help us to determine if we're headed in the right direction. So it's not just in terms of how much land is protected, but how much water, the water quantity and quality, some of the flora biodiversity that's being maintained or being discovered. So our measure of success is, it's not fixed, but there are things we can compare it to say, okay, we're getting closer. The water is improving, the access is improving. The things that we're starting to find are increasing. The wetlands are maintained. So yeah, it's not a fixed target, but we have those 10-year plans that we try to work towards. And at the end of the 10 years, we have a review of how well did we do to try to reach a target. Yeah.
Okay, and in terms of the wildlife economy and the community being drawn into that economy, and Alex, I will come to you. Well, you're going to draw more people back. So now there's an option for a livelihood, a sustained livelihood. So are people, young people who moved away from the rural life, wanting to come back into this? And how are you going to support the people that are going to be drawn back? Or is there a certain number of people that you say, this is where we stand right now?
Okay, so with the wildlife economy, and that's a really good question, what we do is we have almost like a tender process. So people can apply and they'll, we let them know what species are available from which regions. And they can apply to say, I want maybe 5 of this or 10 of this, and we let them know what's actually workable. If you want to have, say, an ecotourism, oh, I love your back. I love what you're seeing there.
Move, everybody. There's about 10 elephants behind me, so you can see, but I don't know.
Wonderful. Oh, that's quite lovely. Jeez. We can swap places anytime. But yeah, so we have that tender process where people can apply, and then we go and evaluate if they want to, for example, participate in an ecotourism perspective. We go and evaluate what their product is, so what activities are going to be taking place, what species we can actually supply them with, and a management plan. So everything in terms of, supplementary feeding, vegetation surveys, water access, and all of those things. To a point, we assist them. However, because we are also busy with our own jobs in SANParks, we have to refer them to either consultants or provincial. But the industry has changed quite a bit. It's not just ecotourism that people are interested in. Obviously, we are aware that these other industries, such as the meat production, for example, venison is quite popular. There's also for better or for worse, there's also the hunting industry that's there as well. So we're quite aware of these, and we give consultation where we can. We do site visits, and then we then donate those animals. But we do have to encourage the people who want to get into these industries that they do need to go further and consult for their management plans in order to make them viable. And we also usually recommend that if they're going to go into the wildlife industry, be it venison, be it ecotourism or any other one, that they start off with other ventures to support it, because it's not a quick moneymaker. It's something that takes time to build into. But when it comes to the actual management plan and their product plan, then their business model, then we advise them to just consult with others.
Okay, no, thank you, Nkabeng. That's fantastic. Alex, if I can ask you to unmute because you've got your hand up there again.
Again, sorry. Okay, cool. So I get to spend a fair bit of time with fly fishermen and then wing shooters as well, from a conservation perspective, just talking to them, finding out what they have to say. Does this project that you guys are busy with allow, and you sort of did answer this question, allow for the utilization of that financial stream? Is it something that we're going to look into, or that you guys are looking into from a long-term perspective? Or is it, excuse me, not really something you guys are interested in?
No, thank you for pointing that one out. I actually sincerely did forget to bring that up. Unfortunately, when it comes to the fish and some of those, we don't touch on it as much as we honestly really should. But it is something that is included in there because there are some activities taking place in the area already. So we're not going to put a stop to it at all. It's just a matter of just assessing the impact, and although it's very low impact, just assessing the situation and seeing how it fits into our model. But it's not something that we're just going to outright put a ban on it. Yeah.
Okay, 100%. Cool. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay, no problem.
Great. And we have a question here from Marette, who wonders if there are any other areas in South Africa that are being targeted for similar national parks. And her suggestion is perhaps the Wild Coast.
Okay. Now that's a good question because although we have the South African national parks, we have the provincial parks such as the Ezemvelo, KZN, and in Northwest. And those are the areas that they're a bit a step ahead of us. So KZN, so Ezemvelo, they are looking at doing this already, and they have already started. So even though it's not national parks driven, yes, it is something that South Africa as a country is going to start and continue to evaluate and take forward. Yeah.
I can tell you that I've learned a lot in this talk, and thank you very much. And I think there is actually a whole nother talk within it in terms of some of the things that are happening inside each space. So we might be approaching you next year, but for now I don't see any other questions. If anyone does want to ask a question, please just put your hand up or write it in the chat. But I think that really was magic. I'll hand over to Aisha, who will bring us to the close. So thank you from me very much indeed.
Thank you, Holly. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Nkabeng. Like Holly said, that was magic. And I've learned a lot today. Like I think I usually, even though I'm in this field of study as well, we usually go in as tourists. And this is sort of seeing behind the scenes, everything that's offered in those parks. So this was, very informative.
I'm glad. Thank you for this opportunity. Very much appreciated.
No, thank you. Thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it.